The klaxons on Kesselanka were the kind of sound designed to bypass thought entirely and go straight into the spine. They were going off in Sector 4, 3 decks up, and the whole station could hear them through the bones of the hull, a long rising note that repeated every 4 seconds like something counting down. People were running. Not walking fast. Running. A Corvain maintenance crew went past the observation window in a blur of grey feathers and loose tool belts, one of them shouting something about a containment breach that nobody stopped to finish hearing. A cargo drone, unmanned and confused by the noise, hovered in the corridor junction, turning in a slow circle until someone shoved it out of the way. Inside Bay 7, none of that was happening. Mira Okafor sat on an upturned supply crate with a folded printout on her knee and a pencil behind her ear. She had a coffee going cold beside her, and she was frowning at 17 down. 7 letters. Stubborn creature. She'd written humans as a joke and then crossed it out because it didn't fit the crossing letters. Behind her, in the dark water of the containment pool, something the size of a delivery shuttle turned over once, slow, and went still again. The alarms kept going. Nobody came to get her. Through the reinforced window above the bay, a lone technician stood frozen with his hand halfway to an emergency channel, staring down at the readout on his panel like it had personally insulted him. He'd been on shift for 11 minutes. This was not the training he remembered signing up for. The readout said, "Subject calm. No response detected." It always said that. It had said that every day for 6 days. And every day, somewhere else on the station, alarms went off for something else entirely. A pressure fault, a supply mix-up, once an actual small fire in a galley 3 decks over. And every day the thing floating in Bay 7's dark water didn't so much as ripple. The technician picked up the comm handset, put it down again, picked it up a second time. On the far side of the reinforced glass, the woman on the crate turned a page and kept reading her clues out loud in a low, even voice that the pickup MIC caught and piped straight into his headset, completely unbothered by a station-wide alarm 3 decks above her head. 6 letters, she said. River in a dead language. Ends in A. Nobody on Kesselanka could explain why any of this was happening, and least of all why it wasn't going wrong. That's the part worth understanding first, so let's go back 6 days, to the morning a dispatch clerk transposed 2 digits on a routine work order, and nobody caught it in time. Kesselanka was a relay station built into the hollow core of a captured asteroid. 3 shifts of crew keeping it running around a clock that didn't mean anything out past the orbit of the nearest sun. It had started life as a fuel depot, been expanded twice, and now housed a permanent population of just under 3,000 across a dozen departments, most of which had nothing to do with each other and rarely crossed paths outside the mess hall. Mira Okafor worked environmental systems. She kept the air scrubbers breathing, tracked filter rotations, and had spent the better part of a year quietly winning a one-woman war against a stubborn algae bloom in the recycling tanks on Deck 6. It wasn't glamorous work. Nobody stopped her in the corridor to talk about it. But the station breathed because people like her made sure it did, and she had found, over 8 years of doing it, that she liked jobs nobody thought about until they stopped working. There was a kind of peace in being necessary and invisible at the same time. She was, by any reasonable measure, good at that job. She was not a xenobiologist. She had, in fact, gone out of her way for 6 months to avoid learning anything about what was kept in Bay 7, on the reasonable theory that whatever required its own dedicated specialist and a reinforced observation window probably wasn't something she needed opinions about. She'd heard the name in passing a few times. The choir, people called it, in the tone people use for something they'd rather not think about directly, and left it at that. The morning it happened, she was 3 sips into her coffee, standing at the requisition terminal outside the environmental bay, when her work tablet chimed with a new assignment. She read it once. She read it again, because the first read hadn't made any more sense the second time. Bay 7, Bloom Chamber Overwatch.
Solo monitor.
Report 0600. She checked the sender code. It traced back to Central Dispatch, a routing error 2 systems removed from anyone she could actually call and yell at before shift start. Somewhere, a clerk transferring in from a different relay entirely had swapped 2 digits on a routine reassignment form, and an assignment meant for Dr. Rencade, currently on medical leave after what the record listed only as an incident, in the specific bloodless language people use when they don't want to describe something, had landed on her instead. She could have flagged it. She stood there for a moment doing the math, how long a formal dispute would take against dispatch, weighed against how long it would take to just show up, drink the coffee, sort it out at the end of shift, and let someone else fix the paperwork. She'd worked with the dispatch office before. Disputes took 4 days minimum, and in 4 days she'd have missed the deadline for both assignments and probably gotten written up for neither showing up nor filing correctly. She picked up her tablet and went to find her coveralls. The corridor down to Bay 7 ran narrower than the rest of the station, lined with warning placards in 4 languages and a strip of yellow floor paint that got more insistent the closer you got, until it turned into a solid band a meter wide just before the outer hatch. The air changed before she reached the door. Warmer. A mineral smell underneath the filtered station air, something old and a little sweet, like wet stone that had been wet for a very long time. Director Vray was waiting outside the outer hatch when she arrived, and Vray did not look like someone having a good morning. Corvain ran tall and narrow, built around a spine that curved forward at the shoulders, with a crest of stiff grey feathers that lay flat when calm and rose when they weren't. Vray's crest was up. It had been up, Mira would learn later, more or less permanently for the last 6 months. "You are not Dr. Cade," Vray said. It wasn't really a question. "No," Mira agreed. "I'm not." Vray looked down at a data slate, back up at her, down again, the particular motion of someone hoping the words might have rearranged themselves in the meantime. "Your file says environmental systems." "That's right." "You have no biological containment training." "I have a coffee," Mira said, holding it up, "and a crossword." One of the junior researchers standing behind Vray made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and got a sharp look for it. Vray's crest lifted another fraction. "This assignment," Vray said, with the exact tone of someone reading a warning label aloud to a person who had already ignored it once, involves solo observation of a Class 9 biological containment subject. In the past 6 months, 3 trained specialists have entered that chamber. 2 required medical evacuation. 1 requested transfer off station and has not been seen since. Mira looked at the sealed hatch. It was a heavy thing, circular, with a manual counter-rotate wheel set into it and a status light glowing a steady amber above the frame. Why does it need overwatch at all, if it's this dangerous? Because the alternative is permanent sealed containment with no observation, and the guild that funds this research does not consider that an acceptable outcome for a possibly sapient organism, Vray said. The subject is a colony organism recovered from a survey world 11 months ago. Coral-based structure, fungal distribution network, unknown cognitive classification. We refer to it informally as the choir, for reasons you will understand once you're closer to it. And it's hurt people. It has blooms, Vray said, and the word came out with weight on it, the specific weight of something that had been capitalized in a report somewhere and had stayed capitalized ever since. A bloom event is a full release of the organism spore and toxin reserves. Airborne, fast, and, depending on proximity, lethal. It has happened 4 times since capture. Every time, without exception, in the presence of a sapient observer. We do not yet understand the trigger. And you want me in a locked room with it? I want, Vray said, with the particular flatness of someone who had stopped wanting anything about this situation several weeks ago, the dispatch error corrected. Since that has apparently not happened in time, and the observation slot cannot go unfilled without a formal waiver that will take 4 days to process, you will enter, you will observe, and you will leave the moment the biometric alarm triggers. Do you understand the protocol? Mostly, Mira said. What's the alarm keyed to? Elevated heart rate. Adrenal markers. Standard fear response thresholds. Vray checked the slate one more time, as though it might have grown a different name on it. You are aware this could kill you. I've read the same report you're holding, Mira said, which wasn't quite true. She'd skimmed the header on the walk down, but it seemed like the kind of thing that would end the conversation faster than admitting otherwise. I'd like to keep my coffee, if that's allowed. Vray stared at her for a long moment. Somewhere down the corridor, a maintenance alert chimed and got ignored by everyone present. Fine, Vray said, in the tone of a person choosing their battles and deciding this one wasn't worth the paperwork. Standard protocol requires threat suppression equipment on entry. Pulse dampener, minimum. I don't have clearance for one. Vray's jaw, the whole lower half of a Corvain face moved in a way human jaws didn't, hinged slightly wider, worked through several responses and discarded most of them. There is a locker 3 doors back with spare gear from the last handler, Vray said. You could requisition it in the time it would take to argue with me about not having it. I could, Mira agreed. But then I'd be standing in there wearing someone else's dampener, worrying about whether it's calibrated right, instead of finishing my crossword. I don't see how that's an improvement. You would rather be unarmed than uncomfortable. I'd rather not carry something into a room that I don't understand and didn't ask for, Mira said. I understand my crossword fine. Vray looked at her for a long moment, the specific look of someone recalibrating an assumption they hadn't realized they were making. Whatever they'd expected walking into this morning, panic, false bravado, at minimum some visible awareness of the stakes, this wasn't it. It wasn't defiance either. It was closer to a person declining an umbrella on a day that didn't look like rain to them, and being mildly puzzled that anyone would insist. No, Vray said finally. You don't have clearance for one. Open the hatch. The inner door of Bay 7 opened on a room bigger than Mira had pictured. The ceiling ran high, lost in the same warm orange lighting the whole corridor had been dressed in, and most of the floor space was given over to a wide, dark pool ringed by a narrow concrete shelf. A few packing crates sat stacked against the far wall, leftovers from whoever had set the chamber up originally, and a single overhead light fixture buzzed faintly on a slightly wrong frequency that she noted automatically, the way anyone in environmental systems notes a hum that shouldn't be there. The pool itself was darker than she'd expected, deep enough that the orange light didn't reach the bottom, and the surface had the faint sheen of something with more in it than water, a mineral film, maybe, or whatever the organism itself put off. It didn't smell wrong exactly. Just old. Older than the station, older than anything built. She catalogued it the way she catalogued most smells on Kesselanka, filing it next to the specific tang of the recycling tanks and the ozone note that meant a filter needed changing, and moved on. She found a crate that looked stable, sat down, and set her coffee on her knee. Above her, through the reinforced window, she could see the shapes of people gathering, more of them than she'd expected for a routine overwatch shift. A technician's voice crackled faintly through a wall speaker she hadn't noticed until it spoke. Cadet Okafor, can you confirm you're reading me? Standard check-in. Reading you, Mira said, without looking up. If at any point you feel unwell, disoriented, or experience unusual, the voice paused, consulted something off MIC, and came back slightly apologetic. Unusual auditory phenomena, please state it clearly and proceed directly to the airlock. Unusual auditory phenomena, Mira repeated. Like what? A pause. The report isn't specific. Understood, Mira said, and didn't look up at them. She had brought the crossword because it was Thursday, and Thursday was crossword day, and moving her whole schedule around for a room she hadn't asked to be assigned to felt like giving the day more importance than it deserved. She unfolded the printout, found her place, and started working through the clues out loud, the way she always did when she needed to concentrate. It helped her think. It'd help her think through worse things than an alien coral reef with a body count, a coolant leak on Deck 3 that had nearly taken out half the recycling loop, a filter fault that had gone undiagnosed for 2 weeks before she traced it, sitting on an equally uncomfortable crate, working through crosswords until the pattern in her own head clicked into place. 7 letters. Capital of the Ilth Compact. She tapped the pencil against her knee. Ah. Verinash. The water in the pool hadn't moved since she'd sat down. Now it did, a slow displacement that pushed a ripple across the surface without breaking it, the kind of motion that suggested something large repositioning itself rather than surfacing. Mira kept her eyes on the crossword. Above, behind the glass, Ossen Vray had both hands flat on the console edge and was watching the biometric feed with the focused stillness of someone waiting for a number to move. It didn't. 64 beats per minute. Stable.
No adrenal spike.
She's not reacting, said the junior researcher standing beside Vray. Her name was Yesha Kaur, and she had the kind of restless attention that made her very good at noticing things and very bad at sitting through briefings. It's 12 meters away and closing, and her heart rate hasn't moved. Perhaps she hasn't seen it yet, Vray said. She's staring right at the water. They both watched as, at the far edge of the pool, the surface broke without a splash. What came up wasn't an animal in the way either of them would have used the word. No single head, no obvious mouth, just a slow unfolding structure of pale coral branch and dark, wet fiber, glistening under the orange light, rising 1.5 meters above the water line and then simply stopping there, motionless, oriented in Mira's direction the way a plant orients toward a window. Mira glanced up from the crossword. She looked at it for a second, the way you'd look at a large dog that had wandered into your yard. Mild interest, no particular urgency, and then looked back down at 17 across. 4 letters, she said. Old word for stubborn. The choir did not move. Neither did Mira's heart rate. According to the panel, Vray was still watching with the fixed attention of a man double checking his own eyesight. Run a diagnostic, Vray said quietly. We ran one 20 minutes ago. Run another one. They ran another one. The sensors came back nominal, same as the first time, same as the time after that. 64 beats per minute.
No spike.
No fear signature of any kind registering on instruments built specifically to catch it. Down in the bay, the choir held its position for nearly 10 minutes, unmoving, the pale branching structure at the top of it turning very slightly, the way a plant turns to track light across a day compressed into minutes. Then, gradually, it began to lower itself back toward the water, not retreating exactly, more settling, the motion of something deciding there was nothing here that required a decision after all. 12 letters, Mira said, to no one in particular, tapping her pencil against the crate. Ancient word for gathering, plural, ends in ed. She didn't get an answer, but she also didn't need one. She filled it in from memory, corrected a letter, and kept going. Up on the gantry, Yesha Kaur had gone very quiet, the specific quiet of someone doing arithmetic they didn't like the answer to. Every previous specialist wore full containment gear, she said slowly. Sealed suits. Filtered air recyclers. Standard threat response posture on entry, weapons adjacent stance, elevated pulse from the chute alone, before the organism had done anything at all. Vray's crest, which had not come down since Mira arrived on shift, dropped by a fraction. And she is sitting in coveralls with a beverage. 64 beats per minute, Yesha said. That's resting. Neither of them said the rest of it out loud. It would take a while yet before anyone was ready to. The first session ran 90 minutes past the standard 15-minute observation window, mostly because nobody upstairs could agree on a reason to end it. When Mira finally stood, folded her crossword, and walked to the airlock, the choir had already sunk most of the way beneath the surface again, and the only sign it had ever come close was a faint shimmer of luminescence fading slowly in the dark water where it had been. Same time tomorrow? She asked, at the console, mostly to fill the silence. Vray looked at her for a long moment. The dispatch correction should be processed by tomorrow, they said. It wasn't. Nobody was in a particular hurry to process it. Mira came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and by the fourth day nobody on the observation deck was pretending this was temporary anymore. The pattern held. She entered at 0558, sat on the same crate, worked through whatever puzzle she'd brought that day, and the choir rose out of the water within the first 10 minutes and held its position at a respectful, unhurried distance, watching her the way it watched the room, patient, unbothered, with no trace of the violent bursts described in every prior incident report. On the fourth day, it moved closer without being invited to. Not fast. It drifted across the shelf at the pace of something reconsidering a decision it had made a long time ago, trailing a faint luminescence along its fiber strands that hadn't shown up in any of the earlier logs. It stopped an arm's length from the crate and stayed there, motionless, for the rest of the session. Yesha Kaur noticed the light before anyone else did, mostly because she was the only one who'd started coming in early to review the overnight footage instead of waiting for the morning briefing. She'd been assigned to the choir project 8 months earlier, fresh out of her guild certification, and had spent most of that time filing incident reports for a supervisor she rarely saw and a subject she wasn't allowed within 30 meters of without a containment suit rated for full toxin exposure. She had opinions about the project that she mostly kept to herself, on the theory that a junior researcher who complained too loudly got reassigned somewhere less interesting. She pulled the archive that afternoon, every incident report Kesselanka had on file for the choir, going back to the day of its capture, and read through them twice before she found what she was looking for. It was buried in the intake log, filed under the extraction team's notes from 11 months earlier, in a section nobody had flagged for follow-up because nothing about it had seemed urgent at the time. Subject exhibited 4-second delay before initial bloom event. Cause unclear. Logged as behavioral anomaly. 4 seconds. Yesha sat with that for a long moment, tapping her stylus against the edge of her slate, and then pulled the biometric data from that same intake, the extraction team's own vitals, recorded automatically by their suits, the way every field teams were. Every single one of them had been running elevated. Not from exertion. The suit's internal sensors had flagged it clearly, adrenal markers spiking the moment the containment doors opened, before the choir had done anything at all. Fear, in other words, arriving first, and the bloom arriving 4 seconds after it. She checked the second incident. Same pattern, different team, same 4 to 6 second delay logged and dismissed as noise. The third incident had no suit telemetry attached, a lab accident, not a field extraction, but the report noted, almost as an aside, that the two researchers present had been arguing loudly moments before the release, their voices audible on the recording, sharp and fast, the specific cadence of two people who are frightened and covering for it with irritation. She pulled the audio itself, out of curiosity more than anything, and sat listening to it twice in the quiet of her office. It wasn't a dramatic argument. Just two colleagues disagreeing over a sampling procedure, voices rising the way voices do when neither person feels heard, nothing in the words themselves that suggested danger. But underneath the words, if she closed her eyes and just listened to the shape of it, there was something unmistakably tense in the rhythm. Short sentences, clipped, the cadence of people bracing without meaning to. She thought about her own voice, the last time she'd argued with someone in a small room. She thought about how it would have sounded to something that had no way of separating an argument about procedure from a warning about a predator, because to that something, both would have arrived exactly the same way, sharp, fast, and loud enough to mean trouble. She checked the fourth incident last, mostly because it was the shortest report on file, filed by a technician who had entered alone for what should have been a 2-minute equipment check. There was no argument in that one. No obvious trigger at all, on the surface. But when she pulled the suit's internal log, she found a heart rate spike logged 90 seconds before entry, not from the chamber, but from an unrelated comm call the technician had taken in the corridor outside, a personal call, upsetting enough that his vitals hadn't fully settled by the time he opened the hatch. He'd walked in already afraid of something that had nothing to do with the room at all, and the room had answered the only way it knew how. 4 for 4. Every documented bloom in 11 months traced back to a human or alien nervous system already running hot before the organism had done anything to earn it. She sat back in her chair. Outside her office window, 3 decks down, Mira Okafor was sitting on a crate reading crossword clues out loud to a room that, according to every incident report on file, should have already tried to kill her 6 separate times. Yesha didn't take the finding to Vray that afternoon. She wasn't sure yet what it meant, only that it meant something, and she wanted to be certain before she said it out loud to a director whose crest had not come down in 6 months and who did not, she suspected, have much patience left for uncertain theories that came from a researcher 3 months out of certification. Instead, she did something smaller. She went down to the observation gantry after her shift ended, when the deck was quiet and Mira had already gone home for the day, and she stood at the window looking at the dark, still water of Bay 7 for a long time. "What are you?" she said, quietly, to no one who could answer her. Down in the pool, in the dark where the orange light didn't quite reach, something shifted, slow, patient, and entirely without malice, and settled again. She went home that night and rewrote her working notes 3 times, trying to phrase the theory in a way that sounded like data and not like a hunch. On the 4th draft, she gave up trying to make it sound more certain than it was, and wrote it exactly the way she'd worked it out, plainly, with the 4-second delay circled twice in the margin, and a single line underneath it that she left in even though it read more like a question than a finding. It was never the room. It was what we brought into it. By the 2nd week, word had gotten around the station the way things did on a facility with 3,000 people and not nearly enough to talk about. Somebody in Bay 7 wasn't dying. That alone was strange enough to travel. That the somebody was an environmental tech who'd been assigned there by clerical accident and kept showing up anyway made it stranger. Mira didn't think of herself as strange for showing up. She had a reason, and the reason was simple, if she'd bothered explaining it to anyone, which she mostly didn't. The Overwatch shift paid the same as her regular hours, the crosswords were better company than the recycling tanks on Deck 6, and, though she wouldn't have put it quite this way, she had started, somewhere around day 5, to enjoy having somewhere to sit and be quiet that nobody bothered her in. The choir had stopped keeping its distance by then. It surfaced within a minute or 2 of her arrival most mornings, drifted close, and settled near the crate the way something settles near a window it likes the light through. On day 9, she brought a second mug by mistake, an old habit from when she used to bring coffee down to the recycling bay for whoever was on the other shift, and found herself, halfway through her crossword, setting it down on the concrete shelf a short distance from the water's edge, out of some reflex she didn't examine too closely. The choir extended a single pale branch strand toward it. Not touching. Just close, the tip of it hovering a hand's width above the rim, the way you'd lean towards something warm without meaning to reach for it. "It's cold by now anyway," Mira said, and went back to her crossword. Up on the gantry, Des Calloway, one of the station's junior maintenance techs, and by that point Mira's most reliable audience, had taken to watching the morning sessions on a spare monitor from the environmental bay, mostly because it was the best entertainment on Kesselanka and partly, he claimed, out of professional curiosity about the chamber's coolant systems, which was almost certainly a lie. You're going to get written up, he told her one evening, over actual coffee, in the actual environmental bay, for fraternizing with a Class 9 biohazard. I'm not fraternizing, Mira said. I left it a mug. You left it a mug. It gets cold in there. I assume. You assume the alien coral thing gets cold. I don't know what it gets, Mira said. I know it leans toward warm things. I've got a mug. It's not complicated. Des looked at her for a long moment with the particular expression of a friend deciding whether to say something or let it go, then decided, as usual, not to let it go. You know, everyone up top thinks you're either fearless or completely unaware you could die. I'm aware, Mira said. I read the incident reports. 3 people got hurt in there before me. So why isn't it hurting you? Mira considered the question the way she considered most things, without much hurry. I don't know, she said honestly. I think maybe it's not trying to. That's not an answer. It's the answer I've got. Des didn't have anything better for that, and neither, at that point, did anyone else on the station with a research title. Yesha Kaur's pheromone theory had made it as far as a working memo, still unofficial, still missing the piece that would turn it from an interesting pattern into something the guild could act on. Vray had read the memo twice and said nothing about it in either meeting since, which Yesha had learned to read as a director quietly reorganizing 18 months of certainty and not being ready to say so out loud yet. The rumor kept traveling anyway, the way rumors do, gaining detail it hadn't earned. By the end of the second week, half the mess hall had heard some version of the story. The crossword tech who tamed the monster in Bay 7, some people said, which wasn't accurate, and made Mira wince slightly every time someone repeated it to her, because it wasn't taming and it wasn't a monster and she wasn't sure how to explain the difference to people who hadn't sat in the room. She found out how far it had traveled on a Tuesday, standing in line for the evening meal, when a systems engineer she'd exchanged maybe 6 words within 3 years leaned over to ask her, with total sincerity, whether it was true she talked to it in its own language. Mira said no. He asked if she'd tried touching it. She said she had, a little, and he took a half step back like she'd told him she juggled live wiring for fun. I heard it glows when you're near it, said someone else further down the line, not even someone she recognized. Like it's happy. It's bioluminescent, Mira said. It probably does that near anyone, eventually. Nobody else got close enough to find out, the woman said, and there was something almost wounded in the way she said it, like Mira had taken something from her by refusing to make the story bigger than it was. Mira took her tray to a corner table by herself after that and ate in the kind of quiet she used to take for granted before any of this started. She didn't mind people asking. She minded, a little, the shape the questions kept taking, like she'd done something clever, or brave, when mostly what she'd done was show up and not make it worse. She wasn't sure how to explain that being unafraid wasn't the same as being fearless, and that most days it didn't feel like either. It felt like doing a crossword. What nobody in either group knew, not Mira, not Yesha, not Vray, was that somewhere in the administrative wing 3 decks up, a different conversation had already started, one with considerably less patience in it. His name was Administrator Corin Vash, and he had not, until that week, spent much thought on Bay 7 at all. His division handled station resourcing and risk assessment, and the choir had sat quietly on his ledger for 11 months as a line item marked ongoing research, minimal engagement required. The line item had recently started generating more paperwork than any of his other 300 projects combined, and Vash did not like projects that generated paperwork without a corresponding explanation he could put in a summary. He had read Yesha's memo. He had read the incident history. He had, against his own better instincts, spent 40 minutes the previous evening watching the archive footage of Mira Okafor doing a crossword next to something that had put 12 people in a medical ward across 4 separate incidents, and had come away from it more unsettled than reassured. Walk me through it again, he said, at the review meeting he'd called on short notice, with Vray, Yesha, and, because he'd insisted on it, over Vray's mild objection, Mira, still in her environmental coveralls, standing at the back of the room with her arms crossed. The subject has ceased exhibiting bloom behavior, Vray said, in the presence of one specific observer, across 14 consecutive sessions. And your explanation for that? We have a working theory, Yesha said, before Vray could answer, and then caught herself, glancing at Vray for permission she hadn't technically been given. Vray gave the smallest possible nod, and she kept going. Every other sapient species catalogued on this station broadcasts fear through airborne pheromone signaling. It's near universal. It's how the ILF read each other, how Corvain read threat displays, how most known biology handles a fight or flight moment. You signal it, chemically, before you even move. Human physiology doesn't do that. Their stress response is entirely internal. No signal goes out. Vash absorbed this with the flat patience of a man who dealt in outcomes rather than mechanisms. So the organism can't smell fear on her because there isn't any to smell. That's the theory, Yesha said. A theory, Vash repeated, based on 14 days of one technician sitting in a room with a crossword puzzle. 14 days with 0 incidents, Vray said, against a documented history of 6 incidents in 6 months prior. Vash looked at Mira for the first time since she'd entered the room. You've read the incident reports. You understand what this thing has done to people. I have, Mira said. And you're not concerned. I'm careful, Mira said. I don't think those are the same thing. Explain the difference. Mira thought about it for a second. Concerned is what I'd be doing if I went in there expecting it to hurt me. I don't. I go in, I do my job, I leave. If something changes, I'll notice, because I notice things for a living. That's not the same as sitting there braced for it. Vash held her gaze for a moment, the particular assessing look of someone who dealt in risk for a living and was trying to work out which column she belonged in. Then he looked back at Vray. I need this resolved formally, not informally. The board wants either a permanent containment upgrade, full lockdown, no further observation, or a certified protocol change. I am not carrying an unofficial arrangement on my books for another quarter. This has already cost more in review hours than the research budget for the entire project. A protocol change requires a formal trial, Vray said. Full observation, guild oversight, multiple species present to confirm the finding holds outside a controlled variable. Then Schedule 1, Vash said. This week. If the theory holds under real conditions, I'll authorize the paperwork myself. If it doesn't, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood what full containment lockdown meant for something that had already shown it could survive being provoked and simply hadn't been, yet, by the one person willing to sit still around it. Full lockdown meant no observers, no researchers, no further contact of any kind. A permanent sealed grave for something that Yesha, at least, was increasingly convinced was trying to say something. What happened to the previous handler? Vash asked, changing direction abruptly, the way he did when he wanted to see whether a fact would land differently coming from a new angle. Dr. Cade. The one this assignment was actually meant for. Vray's crest twitched. Dr. Cade requested extended medical leave following the 3rd incident. He has not indicated an intention to return to this project. Was he hurt? Not physically, Vray said, after a pause that told Vash more than the words did. He wore full containment gear on every entry, exactly as protocol required. He followed procedure precisely, every time, without deviation. And every time, the outcome was the same. So the protocol failed him. The protocol, Vray said, with the particular care of someone choosing not to say something more pointed, was built on the assumption that the danger lived entirely in the organism. It did not account for the possibility that some of it arrived with us. They looked at Mira, briefly, then back to Vash. I do not think Dr. Cade did anything wrong. I think he did everything the guild told him to do, and it nearly killed him 3 times regardless. I would prefer we not repeat that particular success. Vash absorbed that without comment, which was, Yesha had learned over the past week, usually the closest he came to agreeing with something he hadn't thought of himself. I'll want independent witnesses, Vash added, after a moment. Not station staff. Someone with no stake in the outcome either way. The ILF delegation is due for their quarterly trade review in 3 days, Vray said slowly. They could observe. Good. Schedule it around their visit. Vash closed his slate. 1 trial. 1 chance to make the case formally. I'd suggest everyone involved treat it that way. Yesha caught Mira's eye across the room after the meeting broke. You don't have to do this, she said quietly, in the corridor outside. The trial. You could ask for a replacement observer. Who'd do it? Yesha didn't have an answer for that either. I finished my crossword this morning before you called the meeting, Mira said, which wasn't really an answer, and also somehow was. I've got a new one for tomorrow. Yesha walked back to her office after that and sat for a long time with her notes open in front of her, The 4-second delay circled twice, the line underneath it. It was never the room, it was what we brought into it, sitting there looking more like a warning than a finding. In 3 days, for the first time since the choir had come aboard, more than one kind of fear was going to be in that room at once. She didn't know yet whether the theory would survive contact with that, and there was no way to test it except to let it happen. The 3 days before the trial passed slower than any 3 days Mira could remember, which struck her as strange, since nothing about her routine had actually changed. She still went in at 0558. She still sat on the crate. She still worked through her crossword while the choir surfaced and settled beside her, exactly as it had for 2 weeks. The only difference was the knowledge sitting quietly at the back of her mind that this particular routine was about to be watched by people whose entire recommendation would rest on it going exactly right, in front of an audience that had never once been in the room. She mentioned this, once, to Des, over the same corner of the environmental bay they always talked in. "You nervous?" he asked. "I don't think so," she said, and meant it, mostly. "I keep checking, and I don't find anything. It's more like," she searched for the shape of it, "like knowing a test is coming that you can't actually study for. There's nothing to do differently. Either go in and it goes the way it's gone every day, or it doesn't, and either way, showing up nervous wouldn't change the outcome. So there doesn't seem to be much point in it." "That's either extremely healthy or a little bit unsettling," Des said. "I can't decide which." "Can't it be both?" He conceded that it probably could be both. Yesha, for her part, did not sleep well those 3 nights. She ran the archive data a 4th time, a 5th, looking for anything in the historical incidents that might predict what would happen if 2 separate species alarm signals arrived in the chamber at once instead of 1. There was no precedent for it. Every prior bloom had involved a single panicking observer, or 2 arguing quietly, never a delegation of an entirely different species with an entirely different chemical vocabulary standing in a room that had never had to parse more than one kind of fear before. She wrote her concerns into a memo, sent it to Vray at 2 in the morning on the 2nd night, and got a reply 4 minutes later that simply read, "Noted. Proceeding regardless." There is no version of this where we learn the answer without asking the question. The trial was scheduled for that 3rd morning, and word of it moved through the station fast enough that by the time it happened, the observation gantry outside Bay 7 was standing room only. Vray was there, crest held in the flattest configuration Yesha had ever seen on them, which he'd come to recognize as a director trying very hard to look like someone who wasn't nervous. Yesha was there, notes ready, 3 separate slates open in front of her because she hadn't been able to decide which data feed mattered most. Administrator Vash stood near the console with the particular stillness of a man who had already drafted 2 different reports depending on how the morning went, one filed under protocol change, the other under containment upgrade, both sitting ready in his slate's outbox. And beside him, at his insistence, stood a delegation from the ILF Compact, 3 chitinous, low-voiced representatives whose species communicated as much through shared sense signal as through speech, present specifically because their biology made them, according to Vash's reasoning, the most sensitive possible control group. If the theory held with the ILF in the room, it held everywhere. "Full observation protocol," Vray said, to the gathered room, in the tone of someone who had said this sentence too many times that week already. The subject enters no differently than any prior session. Guild sensors record continuously. Any deviation from baseline calm in either party ends the trial immediately. Down in the bay, Mira sat on her crate with her coffee and a fresh crossword, exactly as she had every morning for 2 weeks. Nothing about the room had changed for her. The water was dark and still. The orange light was warm. She found her first clue and started reading it out loud, low and unhurried, the way she always did. 8 letters, she said. Old word for harbour, storm sense. The choir surfaced within its usual window, drifted close, and settled near the crate. On the gantry, someone exhaled audibly. The ILF delegate shifted, low chittering murmurs passing between them, watching the readouts as closely as anyone. One of them, the eldest, kept both of her forward manipulators folded tightly against her thorax the entire time, a posture Yesha would later learn was the ILF equivalent of holding your breath. For the first 11 minutes, everything went exactly the way it had for 2 weeks running. The choir's readings held steady. Mira's held steady. Vash, watching both, allowed himself the smallest possible relaxation of his shoulders, the first since the meeting 3 days earlier. Then one of the ILF delegates, the youngest of the 3, there mostly as an observer rather than a formal party to the assessment, leaned forward against the glass to get a better look at the organism's luminescence, misjudged the distance, and struck the reinforced pane hard enough to make a sound that echoed through the whole gantry, sharp and sudden, a single flat crack of contact that nobody had planned for and nobody could take back. It wasn't dangerous. It wasn't even close to dangerous. The glass didn't so much as scratch. But it was sudden and loud, and every ilth in the room reacted to it the way their biology had wired them to react to anything sudden and loud. A sharp release of alarm pheromone, instinctive and immediate, the same signal that had, on every previous occasion in this chamber's history, arrived a handful of seconds before disaster. The change in the choir was instant. The pale branch structure across its upper mass pulled tight, contracted, every strand snapping toward vertical in a single motion, and a low, resonant hum started up from somewhere deep inside it. Not the low, steady tone it had been carrying for 2 weeks, but something faster, sharper, rising, climbing octave by octave in a way that made the hair on the back of Yesha's neck stand up even through 3 inches of reinforced glass. "That's the pre-bloom signature," Yesha said, sharp and fast, eyes locked on the readout. "That's exactly what the logs describe. 4 seconds. "Get her out," Vash said. "Now. Trigger the evac." Vray's hand was already moving toward the panel. And then it stopped, because through the glass, they could all see Mira Okafor had not moved at all. She hadn't flinched at the sound. She hadn't looked up sharply, hadn't gone rigid, hadn't done any of the small, fast, instinctive things a body does when danger arrives close and sudden. She glanced toward the noise with mild curiosity, the way you'd glance at a door slamming somewhere in another room, registered that it wasn't hers to deal with, and then, because the choir beside her had gone taut and its hum had risen into something with real urgency in it, she did the only thing that had ever occurred to her to do in that chamber. She reached out and put her hand flat against the nearest branch strand, the same unhurried contact she'd used a dozen times before, and she kept reading her crossword clue out loud, the exact same volume, the exact same unbothered pace, as if nothing in the room had changed at all. 9 letters, she said. Old word for calm water. On the gantry, nobody breathed. Vash had one hand frozen an inch from the evac trigger, close enough to feel the warmth of the panel light without touching it. The ILF delegates had gone rigid, the eldest one's manipulators pressed even tighter against her thorax, the sharp scent of their alarm already starting to fade now that the surprise had passed and nothing else had happened to renew it. 1 second went by. Then 2. "Vray," Vash said, low, not taking his eyes off the readout. "Numbers. Rising still. 4th second window is the historical threshold. 3 seconds. The hum inside the chamber had climbed high enough now that it was audible through the glass, a thin, urgent note layered over the deeper one, and every branch strand along the choir's upper mass had drawn in tight against itself except for the one still resting under Mira's palm, which hadn't moved. 4 seconds. Nothing happened. The room upstairs stayed frozen for a beat longer than the silence strictly required, everyone still braced for a 5th second that mattered more than the 4 that had already passed safely, and then, slowly, the sharp climbing note in the choir's hum began to fold back down into itself. 9 letters, Mira said again, unbothered, filling the last box on her page. Harbour. 10 seconds went by. Then 15. The hum in the choir structure didn't die instantly. It came down slowly, the rising sharp note bending back toward the low steady tone it had held for 2 weeks, the branch strand under Mira's palm loosening by degrees until it had gone soft again, drooping gently against her hand the way it always did when it settled. The choir did not bloom. The silence on the gantry afterward had a specific texture to it, the kind that comes when a room full of people watching for a disaster realizes, roughly simultaneously, that the disaster has already happened and quietly failed to occur. Yesha was the first to move, pulling up the full data feed from the previous 90 seconds and running it twice, out loud, for the benefit of everyone still too stunned to trust their own memory of it. "The bloom trigger fired," she said. "Full pre-release signature, matching every documented incident we have on file. Adrenal spike from the ILF delegation, cross-referenced against the organism's chemosensor array, textbook match. And it stopped." She looked up. It stopped on its own, inside the 4-second window, without external intervention. It's never done that before. Not once, in 11 months. "Because it's never had anything to anchor against before," Vray said quietly. It was the first thing they'd said since the alarm sound had struck the glass, and their crest, everyone noticed, had come down for the first time in longer than anyone on the station could remember. Vash lowered his hand from the panel slowly, as if only now remembering it was there. "Explain that." "The organism reads ambient chemical signal," Vray said. That is not in dispute anymore. Every prior handler entered already broadcasting alarm before anything had happened to justify it. Suits, weapon stance, elevated pulse from the moment the door opened. The choir has spent 11 months in a room that told it, every single time, that danger had already arrived, before it had made a single choice of its own. It reacted the only way biology built for that signal knows how to react. Vray looked through the glass, down at the pool, where the choir had settled fully now. It hummed steady and low again, one branch strand still resting lightly against the back of Mira's hand. This is the first time it has had a signal telling it otherwise, strong enough, close enough, sustained long enough, to override an alarm already in progress. It didn't stop because it calmed down, Yesha said slowly, working it through as she said it. It stopped because for the first time, it had something to compare the alarm against. A steady signal it trusted more than the sudden one. It wasn't overridden. It was outvoted. Nobody in the room disputed it. That was the detail Vray would come back to later, turning it over in the weeks that followed. Not that it had been said, but that not one person present had opened their mouth to argue. They had all watched the readout and then watched the glass, and the readout and the glass had told the same story, and there was no comfortable way left to hold onto the old one. The ILF delegation, still standing near the console, exchanged a low series of tones among themselves. Not alarm this time, something quieter, closer to the register their species used for careful reconsideration. The eldest of the three finally spoke, in the flat, translated cadence of a formal statement being composed on the spot. "We came prepared to confirm a hazard," she said. "We did not expect to confirm a communication." "That's premature," Vash said, though without much conviction behind it. He was already looking at his slate, at the 2 draft reports sitting in his outbox, and Yesha watched him delete one of them without ceremony. "Sir," Yesha said, before she could stop herself, "if the theory holds, and I think we just watched it hold under the worst conditions we could have scheduled, then every incident in this organism's file needs to be reread. Not just this one. Every Class 9 chemically reactive containment on any station in the Guild's registry. If the trigger is us, not them, we've been misdiagnosing hazards for as long as we've been cataloguing them." Vash looked at her for a long moment, the look of an administrator doing quiet arithmetic on how many other line items on how many other ledgers were about to become considerably more complicated. "That is a much larger report than the one I came here to write." "I know." "Write it anyway," he said. "Start with this one. I'll clear the review time." It was, Yesha would say later, the first time in 8 months on the project that anyone above her had told her to make a finding bigger instead of smaller. Down in the bay, the intercom clicked, and the technician on duty, steadier now than he'd sounded in weeks, said, "Cadet Okafor, the trial period has concluded. You may exit at your convenience." Mira looked down at the branch resting against her hand. She waited a moment, then patted it once, gently, the way you'd pat a shoulder on your way out the door, gathered her mug and her crossword, and stood. "See you tomorrow," she said, to the room, to the water, to nobody in particular, and walked to the airlock without looking back to see if anything followed. Nothing did. It didn't need to. It had already gotten what it came for. Administrator Vash's report went up the chain 3 days later, and it was, by his own admission afterward, the fastest piece of paperwork he had ever moved through his office. He didn't need 4 review panels. He didn't need 7 months. He had a full biometric record, a corroborated pheromone theory, a formal trial with independent witnesses, and a readout that had, in real time, in front of a room full of people who'd expected to watch someone die, shown a documented hazard interrupt itself. The new protocol was 2 lines longer than the old one. The line that mattered most sat near the top, in plain language, the way Vray had insisted it be written. Handler candidates for chemically reactive biological subjects must be assessed for baseline signal profile prior to threat response equipment assignment. Absence of externalized stress signaling is not a disqualifying condition. It may be the opposite. Nobody called it anything official. Yesha, filling out her own notes on the incident weeks later, wrote the Okafor finding at the top of her file out of habit and then crossed it out, because she suspected Mira would ask her not to use it, and she was right, when she finally worked up the nerve to ask. "Call it whatever gets the paperwork approved," Mira told her, over the second coffee of what had become, without anyone officially declaring it, a standing weekly meeting between the two of them. "I don't need my name on it. It's already on the biometric logs." "That's different. That's just data. This is a name people would actually say." Yesha let it go. She understood, mostly. Not everyone wanted the attention that came with being the answer to a problem that had cost the Guild 11 months and 3 hospitalized researchers to properly ask. Bay 7's reinforced observation window came down to a single pane a week after the trial. Not for any dramatic reason. With a formal bonded observer status now on record, the full triple glass rating simply wasn't required anymore, and the installation crew had an open slot that Tuesday. Vray filed the request personally, which the installation crew noted was unusual enough that one of them asked about it, and got no answer beyond a small adjustment of feathers that might have been a shrug, if Corvain shrugged. Mira kept showing up at 0558. Nothing about the room had changed, except what was written about it in the file. She still brought her coffee. She still brought her crossword. On the second Thursday after the trial, she brought 2 mugs without thinking about it, the way she had a few times before, and set the second one down on the concrete shelf near the water's edge out of the same reflex as always. The choir surfaced slowly, the way it always did, drifted across the shelf, and settled beside her. One pale strand extended toward the mug, close but not touching, the way it always hovered near warmth it liked. Mira unfolded her crossword, found her first clue, and started reading it out loud in the same flat, unhurried voice she used for every clue on every morning, because it helped her think, and because, 11 months into an assignment she still hadn't asked to keep, she had found that thinking clearly, quietly, without hurry, was mostly all I had ever wanted from anyone in the room. The hum settled into its low, steady tone and held there. Somewhere above them, on a gantry that no longer needed 3 inches of reinforced glass between the observers and the water, nobody was running diagnostics anymore. Des had taken to bringing his lunch up to watch some mornings, on the grounds that it was, in his words, the calmest thing on the entire station, which said something about the rest of the station that nobody wanted to examine too closely. Yesha still came by most days, notebook in hand, though she'd stopped writing anomaly in the margins months ago. She wrote other things now. Questions worth following, mostly. There were a lot of them, and she had started to suspect there always would be. Vray came down to the bay itself, in person, on the last day of that month. The first time they had entered the chamber since the trial, standing well back from the water's edge, crest held in a configuration Mira hadn't seen before, something that wasn't quite alarm and wasn't quite ease. I wanted to see it, Vray said, by way of explanation, when Mira glanced up. Without the glass. It's the same room, Mira said. It is not, Vray said. The same room I have spent 11 months looking at through 3 inches of reinforced pane, waiting for the next incident report. They watched the choir shift its weight along the shelf, unhurried. It hummed steady and low, and something in their posture eased by degrees that Mira suspected they weren't fully aware of. I built an entire career on the assumption that danger has a shape you can prepare for. Armor. Distance. Procedure. I am finding it difficult to adjust to the idea that the procedure itself may have been the danger. For what it's worth, Mira said, I don't think anyone did anything wrong on purpose. You were all following the same protocol. It just happened to be a protocol built by people who couldn't help sounding afraid. That is either very generous, Vray said, or a precise description of an institutional failure, and I have not yet decided which. Can't it be both? Vray's crest did something that might, on a Corvain, have counted as the ghost of amusement. They didn't answer. They stood a while longer, watching the light move across the water, and then left the way they'd come, quieter than they'd arrived. Mira went back to her crossword. 22 down. 6 letters. Old word for a safe distance kept, willingly, by something large enough to have chosen otherwise. She filled it in without needing to think about it very hard. The overhead light was orange and warm. The water was still. And somewhere in the quiet space between a woman who had never asked to be here and something that had spent 11 months trying to speak in a room that never once thought to listen, the frequency held steady, waiting, as it always had, for someone to simply stay.